My name is Daniel. I am a son, husband, and father from Boise City, smack dab in the middle of the western end of the Oklahoma Panhandle. How could I have ever guessed that by the age of 27 I would have been completely uprooted from everything I'd ever known, see people I knew and cared for die, either from illness or by their own hand, and that I'd make the most difficult journey of my life. I grew up in no man's land. I remember hearing the old-timers at the stockyard telling stories about how this place got that nickname, piecing together their stories with what I'd learned in the few months that I was able to attend school as a young boy. It seemed that the name came about when Texas had to give up this strip of land in order to join the Union. From 1850 until 1890, no state or territory had claim to this patch of dirt, hence that god-awful, gloomy nickname. I've been farming this land since I can remember. My grandpa and my pa laid claim to it during the great Oklahoma land rush back in 1893, securing the parcel of dirt that would become our home. My grandfather talked about the chaos of that day. Darn near 100,000 people showed up, with all manner of transportation, horses, wagons, trains, bicycle, or on foot. Everyone mad with excitement, trying to secure their American dream and escape the worst economic depression that our country had seen up to that point. Little did they know, a far nastier one was on the horizon. There were only 42,000 parcels to be given out that day. Many men would walk away empty-handed. At precisely 12 noon on September 16, 1893, a cannon's boom signaled the start of the race, and my grandfather fought tooth and nail to secure what he thought would be the family's prosperous future. That first decade was chocked full of blood, sweat, and tears, plowing up acres upon acres of buffalo grass that made up a thick layer of sod on the prairie, planting wheat only to have the crops fail the first couple of tries. By the time I came to be, in the fall of 1908, they had all the sod plowed up and had built a tiny farmhouse, barn, and other various outbuildings. I was born in that tiny farmhouse. My ma used to tell stories of how Pa could be heard outside the door of the bedroom pacing back and forth until there was a loud thud as he passed out from the excitement and worry of it all. My childhood was chocked full of blisters and calluses, more labor than any child should have to endure. There was no time for school or play. What little time I had to myself I spent fishing or hunting rabbits to contribute to the dinner table. I did not complain, though. Somewhere deep inside I knew that this was a real and honest life. As a teen in the early 1920s, we saw wheat prices begin to rise. They just kept climbing, I suppose, in response to the war going on in Europe. We had seen a few droughts come and go, but toward the end of the decade we had a few wet years and our wheat was beautiful and plentiful. So was everyone else's. Word of our farming successes were reported throughout the country, causing a huge number of newcomers to migrate to the area. They were looking for easy money. Suitcase farmers showed up in droves. We called them that because they didn't have any attachments to our town or even Oklahoma for that matter. They traveled back and forth from big cities to check on their crops, just trying to make the kind of money that we had made in those first few years. I met Mary at a barn dance in 1926. I took one look at her and was done looking at anyone else ever again. She was the prettiest thing in the country. We married in 1927 and took over the farm when my mother fell ill and my pa took her back east to get better care. Mary moved into the tiny farmhouse and quickly set out to make it her own. Our first son, Jacob, was born in 1929 and John followed in 1930. My new little family was my everything. I had big dreams for us. The next few years brought us some beautiful wheat and a lot of money that we quickly reinvested into our wheat production. With the future looking so promising, we borrowed some money from the bank to buy a little more land, a mechanical plow, and other updated machinery for the farm. It wasn't just me, other farmers had the same idea. The Great Plains were turned into mostly wheat fields in a few short years. Reporters were calling it the Great Plow-Up. 1931 brought with it a pretty hard drought. We had seen it before. All but 2 of our crops failed. It was a tough year, but we knew it would rain soon, and we would get back to it, or so we thought. 1932 brought another year of little to no moisture. I began to worry a bit. The bank was being patient as they could see the impossible situation we were in and knew, too, that droughts happen occasionally. It made me feel a little better knowing they were willing to work with us. Then came the dust. Cataclysmic, suffocating storms of blackness, blowing through our town and across our fields with such force that it could blister your face. We'd seen dust storms before, but not like this. We had at least 14 that year. Big black walls that you could see coming from miles away, giant pillars sometimes a mile high of black dust rising up to choke out the sun. In 1933, the drought continued. We saw 33 dust storms that year, and I began to worry about feeding my family and providing for their other needs. My wife was good at hiding her worry, but I could see it in her eyes. By now, the country was in the grips of the Great Depression, and most of America had bigger things to worry about than the Great Plains farmers and their families that were drowning in dust. Because of the Depression, the few crops that actually survived the weather went for such low prices that we could not make a living. The bank began to get a little more agitated by our inability to make payments. Most of our kin and the other townfolk were in the same situation as us. And when it seemed that things couldn't get any bleaker, the sickness came. Dust pneumonia, called the brown plague, killed hundreds and seemed to be deadlier for infants, children, and the elderly. Things just continued to get worse. Many people thought it was the apocalypse. If it wasn't the end of the world, it was for sure a disaster of biblical proportions. All of us men, normally hard-working, self-reliant, resilient, and strong-willed, found ourselves unable to provide for our families. What kind of place had we staked all of our hopes and dreams in? A place where children couldn't go outside, where the air itself could kill you? Damn this dust. Every time a little rain fell, our hopes rose. We would imagine that the jagged years were ending. They were not. Our hopes would dry up in the sun and heat the next day. People lost their farms and homes. I really began to struggle to keep my own mind in check. The fear, pain, and suffering of it all was a lot to handle. It proved too much for some. Suicides were rampant as people began to lose all hope. On Sunday, April 14th, 1935, we woke up to a beautiful sunny day. The sky was clearer and bluer than we'd seen in weeks. The wind was gone and the temperatures were cool. Wishful thinking had us dreaming of the future again. Those dreams were crushed soon enough. In just a couple of hours, the temperature dropped more than 30 degrees, bringing with it that damn wind. It created a dust wall that became hundreds of miles wide and thousands of feet high as it gathered steam and headed right toward us. The black blizzard hit us with a force. It tore off the last few shingles and strips of tar paper left on our house. It lasted hours. Panic began to take hold of us. Was this Armageddon? It was the worst black blizzard we had seen. It lasted longer and covered more ground. That day would be known ever after as Black Sunday. The next day, a reporter wrote a story about it, referring to life in the Dust Bowl of the continent. The name Dust Bowl stuck. It's what our area became known as. Stories of our suffering, written in the wake of Black Sunday, helped the rest of the country see the struggles we were going through. Help might have been on the way now, but I had given up hope. It was time to leave this God-forsaken place. To tell the truth, I was done 2 years ago. I was just desperately clinging to my grandfather's dream, trying to wait it out, not wanting to be weak and just give up. You can't imagine how difficult it is to have to decide between keeping your family's only shelter and feeding them. In any case, the bank had announced their decision to foreclose on us weeks ago, and we hadn't figured out what to do yet. Black Sunday sealed the deal. We were only a few of the 65,000 people that had to make that decision. It wasn't easy for any of us. I could hear my wife's quiet sobs in the days leading up to the move. She never let me see her cry. I reckon she didn't want to be seen as weak either. Mary's uncle had made the decision to leave last year. He took his family to California. A few months later, he hopped a freight train and came back to Boise City to gather up the rest of their belongings. While staying at our house, he told me that he had been able to find work picking the very day he arrived in California. He was making $5 a day, more money than I had made in years. It didn't take Mary and me long to pack, as most of what we owned had already been destroyed by the wind and dust, or sold or traded for food. We piled into our old pickup truck and headed west with San Luis Obispo County in our sights. We had very little money for food and gas. Mary's uncle sent us a small amount when he received word that we would be making the journey. I will never forget the looks on my boys' faces as we passed through the western border of Arizona and into California. We began to see green grass, green trees, and green fields. It was the most beautiful color green we had ever seen. I realize now just how lucky we were to have made that trip with no real trouble. Other than a few flat tires and a close call with a few deer. There were other stories, though, stories of no gas, no food, death from illness or exposure, and roadside burials. Yes, we had been damn lucky. Those first few days in California after we arrived were hard, but they were an easier hard than what we had just come from. We found a place to park near a clear stream and set up a tent where we could live until I could find work and a proper place for us to live. Finding work proved very easy. I was able to get on at a pea farm near where we were camped, and there was housing available for the family too. After a couple of weeks, we were able to move in. We weren't treated very well in those days. People took to calling us Okies. Locals were angry that so many people from the Great Plains had come seeking refuge in their state. We had been put into the same social class as colored folks. Some businesses required that we used a separate entrance, and some cafes wouldn't even serve us. Oklahomans are a proud, strong people, and Mary and I tried not to let their actions affect us, but it was tough to be judged so harshly just because of your roots. I understood that they feared for their own jobs. The poor treatment of us Okies made Mary and I understand racism on a whole different level. Having never given it much thought before, we began to see the effect it could have on a man's self-worth. The years that followed were full of struggle and joy, mixed up into one big ball of life. Things in the Dust Bowl were getting better, according to the newspaper. The government had moved in to show farmers how to stabilize the soil and keep it under their feet where it belonged. Rotating crops and irrigation were all a part of the puzzle. Roosevelt's Farm Security Administration program was helping a lot of folks get back to work and helping to feed their families too. I was not interested in going back, but I often wondered what life would be like today if we had stayed. I can't be 100% certain that all four of us would still be breathing, and that right there is enough to justify us leaving. We have moved on to a big orange orchard. The boss is nice and has moved me into a supervisor position. The housing is much nicer. The children attend school just down the road, and Mary works there as an assistant to the teacher. It is only now that we are learning the full damage that the Dust Bowl had on the country. Only now are we fully understanding the role that we all played in it. The paper says that it was a man-made ecological disaster. The 10-year drought would have come and gone in the cycle that droughts always do, but all of that exposed soil and poor farming practices made things so much worse. I hesitate to call them poor practices. We were doing what we knew how to do. We'd been fooled for years by people telling us that the rain follows the plow, and don't worry about plowing too deep. Soil makes good mulch and will help keep your crops moist. Fallacies that we all took to be truth. We know the real truth now. How could we not? I have not been back to Boise City. I don't know if I could ever go back. I have mourned my losses and still have some lingering poor feelings from the trauma of it all. As I sit here on the porch of my home, I see that life is good today, and it will be tomorrow. We have enough to eat today, and we will tomorrow. There are no monstrous black dust clouds on the horizon, only the setting sun and the promise of continued better days ahead.